The man, Run, did not check his watch. Time was a variable he controlled, not one he submitted to. It was now 17 minutes past the agreed-upon hour. The sun had completed its long, slow surrender to the horizon, bleeding streaks of persimmon and violet across the bruised twilight sky. The air, once warm with the day's heat, now carried the cool, saline breath of the Pacific. He sat on a simple indigo mat, a lacquered bento box open before him, its contents a mosaic of culinary precision. Tamagoyaki rolled into a perfect, butter-yellow spiral, glistening unagi nestled on a bed of rice, a single, sculpted umebashi, its puckered skin a deep, arterial red. This was a gesture, a concession to a world of normal customs he had long ago abandoned. A blind date, arranged by an old associate who insisted Ren needed a life outside the architecture of his obligations. He had agreed not out of loneliness, not out of hope, but out of a sterile curiosity. It was an experiment in a life he did not lead. The woman was not coming. This was not a disappointment. It was merely a data point. The equation was solved, the result null. He would wait another 3 minutes, a tribute to the arbitrary nature of social grace, and then he would pack the untouched meal and disappear back into the city's concrete canyons, where silence meant something entirely different. The waves whispered against the shore, a steady, indifferent rhythm. And then, a disruption. A new variable entered the controlled environment. A young woman, wearing a pale pink shirt the color of diluted cherry blossoms and faded blue jeans, stopped a precise 7 feet from the edge of his mat. She was not a threat. Her posture was open, her hands empty, her gaze direct and unburdened by the kind of caution his presence usually inspired. He had been observed, he knew, but her observation lacked the sharp, assessing quality of an enemy or the fearful deference of an underling. It was simple, uncomplicated curiosity. She stood there for a long moment, a silhouette against the deepening dark, and then she spoke, her voice clear and without artifice, carried on the sea breeze. "Can I eat with you?" Ren's world operated on a system of intricate ledgers. Every action, every word, every breath was an entry, weighed and measured for its effect on a delicate and lethal balance. The question was not an entry, it was a crack in the page itself. It belonged to a different book entirely, one written in a language he had forgotten. He did not move. His hands rested, palms down, on his knees. The stillness was a weapon, a shield, a statement. It was a language most people understood instinctively. They would falter, apologize, retreat. This woman did not. She simply waited, her expression one of genuine inquiry, as if she had asked for the time or for directions. He analyzed her. 20, perhaps. The fabric of her clothes was worn but clean. There was a tiredness around her eyes that spoke of long hours and low pay, but it was not the corrosive exhaustion of despair. It was the simple fatigue of a life lived without safety nets. She carried no purse. Her shoes were scuffed canvas. She was an anomaly, a piece that did not fit the intricate game board of his life. She should have been afraid. He was a man who radiated a specific kind of gravity, a density that warped the space around him. People's eyes slid away from him on the street. Conversations hushed when he entered a room. This was a carefully cultivated effect, a necessary tool of his trade. Yet, this woman looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. He finally shifted his own, from her face down to the bento box. The food was perfect. It was a shame to let it be consumed by the indifferent ocean air. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an invitation, not a welcome, but an acknowledgement of her existence within his immediate proximity. A granting of temporary access. She took it as the welcome it was not, and with a small, grateful smile, she stepped onto the mat, folding her legs beneath her with a natural, unstudied grace. She did not sit too close, maintaining a respectful distance, but her presence was a profound intrusion, a warm, living thing in the cold, calculated vacuum he maintained around himself. She looked at the food, her eyes wide with an appreciation that was so pure it bordered on painful to witness. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "It looks like a painting." Ren said nothing. He slid a pair of unused chopsticks from their paper sleeve and placed them before her. An offering, an act so divorced from his normal behavioral patterns that it felt like it was being performed by another man entirely. He watched as she picked up a piece of the sweet, rolled omelet, her movements careful, almost reverent. She ate it slowly, her eyes closing for a moment in simple, unadulterated pleasure. The silence that stretched between them was no longer his. It was shared. From her vantage point on the terrace of Aurelia, the upscale restaurant that bled golden light onto the darkening sand, Cleo watched the scene unfold. Her shift was over. The long red apron was untied, folded over the back of a chair. All that remained was the final accounting, the quiet ritual of cashing out and ensuring her station was immaculate for the morning crew. But she lingered. She was an observer by nature and by trade. For 5 years, she had read the subtle tells of the city's elite, the flicker of dissatisfaction in a financier's eye, the furtive glance between a husband and a woman who is not his wife, the forced joviality of a business deal gone sour. She read people like text, discerning subtext, and hidden clauses. Tonight, her attention was fixed on the 2 figures on the beach. The man had been there for nearly an hour. She had noticed him when he arrived, not because he was loud or conspicuous, but because he was the opposite. He moved with a kind of predatory deliberation, his stillness more potent than any overt display of power. He was dressed in a suit of impossible quality, the dark charcoal fabric absorbing the last of the light. It was tailored so precisely it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. He did not belong on a beach, yet he did not look out of place. He simply imposed his own context on the environment. She knew his type, or at least she knew the archetype. Old money, new money, or a kind of money that operated on an entirely different economy. Dangerous money. Then the girl had appeared. A stark, vivid contrast. Cleo had watched her approach, her body language a lexicon of innocence. When the girl sat, Cleo felt a knot of professional concern. She felt a sliver of something else, too. Not fear. Cleo had long ago catalogued her own fear and filed it away in a place where it could not interfere with her judgment. This was a clinical interest. The man was a closed system, a fortress. The girl was a key turning in a lock he probably didn't know he had. Cleo watched them for another 10 minutes. The man barely moved. The girl ate with a quiet joy. The geometry of the scene was fascinating. The vast, empty space of the beach, the encroaching darkness, and these 2 disparate points of light and shadow, creating a tension that was almost visible. She made a decision. It was not a logical one, not a safe one. It was an intuitive leap, a response to a question the scene seemed to be asking. She picked up a bottle of chilled Sancerre, one that a patron had left half-finished, and 2 clean glasses. She tucked the bottle under her arm, holding the stems of the glasses in one hand, and walked out of the restaurant, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. Her approach was a study in controlled purpose. Cleo did not hesitate, did not meander. She moved in a straight line, her gaze fixed on the indigo mat. Her presence registered with the man long before she arrived. She saw his head lift, his focus shifting from the girl to her. His eyes were dark, and in the faint light from the distant pier, they seemed to possess a flat, non-reflective quality, like obsidian. He tracked her movement, his body remaining perfectly still. It was the stillness of a great cat watching a new animal enter its territory, not with aggression, but with absolute, calculating attention. She stopped at the edge of the mat, just as the first girl had. She did not wait for an invitation. "You looked like you needed a better vintage," Cleo said. Her voice was low and smooth, a resonant contralto that carried easily over the sound of the waves. It was a statement of fact, not an offer. She knelt, her movements fluid and economical, and placed the 2 glasses and the bottle of wine on the mat between them. The first girl, Lily, looked up at her, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, then a slow, dawning smile. Ren's gaze did not leave Cleo's face. He was processing her. The white shirt, the faint scent of expensive food and clean linen that clung to her, the unwavering confidence in her eyes. He was dissecting her motives, her angle, the potential threat she represented. She was not an innocent like Lily. She was not a subordinate. She was not an enemy combatant. She was something else. A player from a different game, who had just stepped onto his board. Cleo met his analytical stare without flinching. She saw the intricate machinery working behind his eyes, the rapid calculations. She was not intimidated. She was, in a strange way, validated. He saw her. He was reading her with the same intensity she was reading him. She was stood up, Lily offered, as if to explain the situation to the newcomer. Her innocence was a buffer, a translator between the two silent, assessing forces. I saw. The food is too good to waste on disappointment, Cleo replied, her words directed at Lily but her attention still locked on Rin. She uncorked the wine with a practiced twist of her wrist, the sound a soft pop in the quiet air. She poured a measure into each glass, the pale gold liquid catching the distant lights. She pushed one glass towards Rin. He looked at the glass, then back at her. For the first time, a micro-expression shifted the severe lines of his face. It was not surprise. It was not suspicion. It was the faintest trace of intrigue. A new problem he was not entirely displeased to solve. He lifted the glass. The equilibrium of the scene had been irrevocably altered. What had been a simple, bizarre tableau of innocence and danger was now a complex triangle of forces. Lily, sensing the shift, finished her food with a quiet haste. The air between the man and the new woman was thick with unspoken language, a current of energy she did not understand but could feel as plainly as the cool sand beneath her. She stood up, brushing the sand from her jeans. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and sincere, directed at Rin. "That was the best meal I've ever had." He gave another of his infinitesimal nods, an acknowledgement that the transaction was complete. Lily smiled at Cleo, a quick, bright flash of gratitude, then turned and walked away, melting back into the darkness from which she had emerged. Her departure left a vacuum, and the silence that rushed in to fill it was of a different quality. It was charged, analytical. Cleo took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving Ren's face. He had not touched his. He held the glass, his fingers wrapped around the stem, his thumb resting on the base. It was the grip of a man who understood the precise weight and balance of an object, be it a wine glass or a weapon. "You are not a waitress," he stated. It was not a question. "I am an excellent waitress," she countered, her tone level. "But that is a role, not a definition." He considered this. His world was full of roles, of masks worn for function and survival. He understood the distinction better than most. "You saw a situation and chose to intervene. Why?" he asked. The question was direct, clinical. He was seeking data. "I saw a miscalculation," she replied, equally clinical. "A man of your precision should not be drinking convenience store tea with a meal like that." "It's an aesthetic dissonance," her answer seemed to please him. It was an appeal to his own nature, logic, order, a respect for quality. It was a language he understood. He finally raised his glass and took a small, measured sip of the Sancerre. He swirled the liquid, his expression unreadable as he tasted it. "Acceptable," he murmured. It was the highest form of praise she could have expected. The quiet was broken by a new sound, harsh and unwelcome. The crunch of boots on sand, the low, guttural laughter of men who mistook the darkness for impunity. 3 of them materialized from the direction of the pier. They were broad, clumsy shapes, their movements lacking any of the economy of the man on the mat. They were predators of a lower order, jackals drawn to what they perceived as a vulnerable scene, a well-dressed man, a lone woman, an expensive bottle of wine. "Look what we have here," the leader slurred, his eyes fixing on Cleo. "Date night." Rin did not look at them. He continued to gaze out at the dark, inscrutable ocean. He placed his wine glass carefully on the mat. He did not rise. He simply shifted his weight, a minute adjustment, but one that coiled the energy in his body like a spring. "Leave," he said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the night air with the chilling finality of a blade. The men laughed. The leader took a step forward. Or what? It happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Not a fight. A fight implies a contest, a struggle between two opposing forces. This was a removal, an erasure. Run moved with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was a blur of dark fabric and precise, brutal motion. There was the sound of a sharp impact, a wet crack, and the leader crumpled to the sand without a sound. The other two froze, their drunken bravado evaporating into sheer, primal terror. Run was on his feet now, standing over their fallen comrade. He hadn't used a weapon. He had used his hands, his elbows, the hard edge of his shoe. It was a clinical deconstruction of 3 human bodies. The second man tried to run. Run took one fluid step and swept the man's legs out from under him. He fell hard, his head hitting the sand with a dull thud. The third man simply stood, paralyzed, shaking. Run walked calmly to him, took him by the collar, and spoke a few words in Japanese, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. The man's eyes went wide. He scrambled backward, falling over himself, then got up and ran, stumbling into the darkness. The entire event had taken less than 5 seconds. Cleo had not moved. She hadn't screamed, hadn't flinched. She had watched with a kind of detached, professional fascination. She had seen violence before, the messy, desperate kind. This was different. This was art. It was the terrifying, beautiful precision of a master craftsman at his work. Ren turned back to her. There was no blood on him. His suit was unruffled. His breathing was even. He looked back at the 2 unconscious forms on the sand as if they were little more than discarded pieces of trash. He picked up his wine glass. As I was saying, Cleo said, her voice perfectly steady. Aesthetic dissonance. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was more a rumor than an expression, touched Ren's lips. He sat back down on the mat, crossing his legs with the same unhurried deliberation as before. The 2 bodies on the sand were an inconvenient footnote, a problem to be solved later. For now, they did not exist. He took another sip of wine, his gaze returning to Cleo. The violence had not been a display. It had been a reflex, a function of his existence, as natural to him as breathing. And her reaction, or lack thereof, had told him more than an hour of conversation ever could have. She was not merely composed. She was unimpressed by the act itself, only by its execution. She understood that violence in his world was not about anger or passion. It was a tool, a form of communication, a means of maintaining order. You are not afraid, he observed. Fear is a poor allocation of resources, she replied, quoting a maxim she'd once read in a book on corporate strategy. It seemed to fit the moment. It clouds judgment, he nodded, accepting this as a fundamental truth. My associates will be here in 10 minutes to clean this up, he said, the statement as casual as a comment on the weather. It will be as if they were never here, she believed him. The kind of power that allowed for such clean, efficient violence was the same kind that could erase its consequences. They sat in a new kind of silence, the aftermath of the brief, brutal storm. The air was clear now, the tension of the unknown replaced by the certainty of a shared, dangerous knowledge. He had revealed a fundamental part of his nature, and she had accepted it without comment. This created a strange, unspoken intimacy between them, a bond forged in the crucible of a 5-second ballet of brutality. Everyone has a ledger, she said quietly, looking out at the dark water. An accounting of their choices, their actions, their compromises. He turned his head slowly to look at her. Her profile was elegant against the distant city lights, her expression thoughtful. She had, with startling intuition, touched upon the central metaphor of his life. He lived by a strict, internal code, a ledger of debts and credits, of honor and obligation. Every action was an entry. Tonight's violence was a minor debit, a necessary expenditure to restore balance. His entire existence was the careful, relentless maintenance of this internal account. Most ledgers are written in red ink or black, he said, his voice a low murmur. Mine is written in shades of gray. Gray is the color of reality, she countered. Black and white are for fairy tales. He felt a strange resonance with her words, a sense of being seen and understood in a way that was both unsettling and profoundly comforting. For years, he had moved through the world as a ghost, a functionary, an instrument of a vast and shadowy organization. He was a name whispered in fear, a symbol of implacable power. But he had long ago ceased to feel like a man. He was an architecture of duties, a fortress of control. Cleo was not looking at the fortress. She was looking at the man inside. She saw the precision, the control, the violence, and she was not looking away. She was simply taking account, adding it all to her own ledger. The distant whine of a powerful engine grew closer, then faded, a confirmation of Ren's promise. The beach was clean again. The tide was coming in, washing away the indentations in the sand, erasing the last physical evidence of the brief, violent interruption. But the space between Ren and Cleo was permanently altered. The beach, once a neutral ground, was now a crime scene, however sanitized. The intimacy of the moment had been compromised by the intrusion of his world. "This place is no longer suitable," he stated, rising to his feet in one smooth motion. He began to pack the bento box, his movements precise and methodical, placing the lid on with a soft click. He folded the indigo mat into a perfect, crisp square. It was a ritual of closure. Cleo watched him, recognizing the need to restore order, to control the environment. She stood as well, holding the half-empty bottle of Sancerre. "Where are we going?" she asked. It was a question of genuine curiosity. She had no fear for her own safety. The violence she had witnessed had not been chaotic. It had been targeted, purposeful. She was not a target. She was, for some reason he had yet to articulate, under his protection. He looked at her, then at the glittering, indifferent skyline of the city. His world was one of opulent penthouses, hidden restaurants with no names on the door, and sterile boardrooms where fortunes and lives were decided in hushed tones. None of those places were right. They were part of the architecture, the fortress. He needed a neutral space, a place that belonged to neither of them. "Someplace quiet," he said. He started walking, not towards the glittering lights of the boardwalk, but away from them, towards the quieter, darker streets that lay behind the facade of the tourist district. She fell into step beside him. They walked without speaking, their footsteps a soft, synchronized rhythm on the pavement. The city swallowed them. The sounds of the ocean were replaced by the distant hum of traffic, the lonely cry of a siren, the clatter of a restaurant kitchen closing for the night. The city was a vast, sprawling organism, oblivious to the small, intense drama of the two figures moving through its arteries. The narrator's voice, for a moment, could pull back, observing them as mere specks in a vast, glittering grid of light and shadow, two souls moving through the urban landscape, each a container of immense, controlled force. Then it would zoom back in, tight on their faces, on the small space between them, a pocket of charged stillness in the city's chaotic flow. They walked for 3 blocks, then 4. He was leading them somewhere specific. He stopped in front of a small, unassuming building, a 3-story walk-up wedged between a closed laundromat and a darkened bakery. It was anonymous, forgettable. "My place is on the 3rd floor," she said, preempting him. "It's quiet." He looked from the building to her face, his expression unreadable. He had not been leading them here. He had been leading them to a 24-hour diner he knew, a place of sterile anonymity. But her suggestion was better. It was a gesture of trust. A profound one. He had shown her his capacity for violence. She was showing him her sanctuary. It was a strategic move, an offering in their silent negotiation. He gave a single nod. "Lead the way." The climb up the 3 flights of stairs was made in silence. The building was old, the air thick with the scent of dust and the faint, lingering ghosts of 1,000 cooked meals. The only sound was the soft creak of the wooden steps under their feet. It was a world away from the cold, steel and glass towers Ren inhabited. His life was climate-controlled, soundproofed, scrubbed of any imperfections. This place was real, lived in, bearing the marks of time and human frailty. It was, in its own way, more intimidating than any boardroom. Cleo's apartment was a single, large room, a studio that was as meticulously ordered as one of Ren's business dealings. There were no superfluous objects. A bed neatly made in one corner. A small, functional kitchen area, the steel surfaces gleaming. A comfortable-looking armchair. And books. Books everywhere. Stacked on the floor, lining the windowsills, filling two tall, simple pine shelves. They were not for decoration. Their spines were creased, their covers worn. History, philosophy, economics, poetry. It was the arsenal of a well-armed mind. She did not apologize for the smallness of the space. She simply moved into it with a sense of ownership and peace. She placed the wine bottle on the small kitchen counter and turned to face him. "Tea," she offered. "I have a genmaica that's quite good." Ren stood in the center of the room, his presence seeming to shrink the space. He looked out of place in his perfect suit, a creature of the shadows brought into a small, warm pocket of light. He surveyed the room, his eyes taking in every detail. The books. The single, healthy-looking fern on the windowsill. The photograph on her small desk, a smiling older couple, presumably her parents. These were the details of a life. A real one. A life built, not inherited. A life maintained through discipline and intellect, not violence and fear. It was a mirror of his own internal drive for order, but its foundation was entirely different. His was built on a bedrock of fear and power. Hers was built on knowledge and self-possession. "Yes," he said, his voice softer than it had been all night. Tea would be good, while she moved with quiet efficiency in the kitchen, filling a kettle, measuring out loose-leaf tea into a small, earthenware pot. He remained standing, a statue of dark-suited stillness. He was processing the dissonance, the brutal efficiency on the beach, the quiet domesticity of this room, the woman who navigated both worlds with the same unnerving calm. He had agreed to the blind date on a whim, an attempt to simulate a life that was not his. He had expected an evening of awkward small talk, of pretending to be a man he was not, a banker, an importer, some other blandly successful professional. He had not expected this. He had not expected to be confronted with a more profound version of himself, reflected in the eyes of a woman who worked for tips on a restaurant terrace. The kettle began to whistle, a shrill, domestic sound that was utterly alien to his world. Cleo poured the hot water into the pot, the steam rising to curl around her face. She brought two simple, handleless cups and the teapot to a small table near the window. She sat, gesturing for him to join her. He moved, finally, and sat opposite her. The chair was small, but he folded his large frame into it without awkwardness. She poured the tea. The nutty, roasted scent of the genmaica filled the small space. It was a scent of comfort, of home, a concept he understood only in the abstract. For a long time, they drank their tea in silence. It was a comfortable quiet now, not the analytical, assessing silence of the beach. Here, in the small sanctuary of her apartment, surrounded by the quiet testimony of her books, the need for posturing and calculation seemed to fall away. The city hummed its endless lullaby a few stories below them. Ren held the small ceramic cup in his hands, the warmth seeping into his palms. He was a man whose hands were instruments of control, of violence, of signing documents that could ruin or create fortunes. He could not remember the last time they had simply held something warm. Cleo watched him over the rim of her own cup. She saw the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, a subtle unclamping of muscles that had likely been coiled for years. She saw the way his eyes tracked the steam rising from his tea, as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. She had taken a tremendous risk, bringing him here. But her intuition had told her it was the only move to make. To meet him in a place of power, his or hers, would have been to continue the game. Here, in this humble, neutral space, they could be something other than their roles. "The man who arranged the date," Ren said, his voice low, breaking the silence. "He is old. He knew my father. He worries that my life lacks balance." It was a confession. A small, carefully offered piece of his internal world. He was explaining himself not to her, but perhaps to himself, using her as a sounding board. "He believes a wife, a family, would provide a necessary counterweight to my professional obligations. And do you believe that?" she asked gently. There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet inquiry. He considered the question for a long time, staring down into the pale green liquid in his cup. "I believe in balance," he said finally, "but I do not believe it can be arranged. It is not an acquisition. It is a state of equilibrium. And my life is, by its nature, in a permanent state of disequilibrium." He was speaking of his soul, as if it were a complex physics problem he was tasked with solving. He looked up from his cup and met her eyes. The flat, obsidian quality was gone. In the soft light of her apartment, she could see a flicker of something else deep within them. A profound, aching weariness. The exhaustion of a man who had been holding up a mountain for a very long time. "You carry it all," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an observation. The weight of your name, your father's legacy, the lives of the men who follow you. The violence required to maintain it. He did not respond, but the slight tightening of his jaw was confirmation enough. She reached out, her fingers not quite touching his hand where it rested on the table. It was a gesture of profound empathy, a bridging of the small gap between them. "No one is built to be a fortress forever, Rin," she said, speaking his name for the first time. It sounded natural, right? Even stone eventually cracks under the weight. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of his name on her lips. It was a name that was always spoken with fear or with a calculated, formal respect. He had never heard it spoken with such simple, unadorned humanity. It landed on him not as a title, but as a recognition of the man inside the suit. A man he himself had almost forgotten existed. The bridge between them was not built of soft words or romantic promises. It was built of sterner stuff, mutual recognition, a shared language of control and observation, and an unflinching acceptance of the darkness each of them understood. He saw in her a strength that was not physical, but intellectual and spiritual, a stillness that was not born of menace, but of profound self-possession. She had faced him and the violence he represented, not with defiance, but with a calm, analytical gaze that had disarmed him more effectively than any weapon could have. She saw in him not a monster, but a man trapped within an architecture of brutal necessity. A man who still appreciated the aesthetic perfection of a well-made meal, who understood the dissonance of cheap tea, and who was, underneath the layers of lethal control, simply and profoundly tired. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "After, on the beach. Most people would have run. Most people see the world in black and white," she replied, her hand now resting lightly on the table, a few inches from his. "They see a monster and they run. I saw a man solving a problem. An ugly problem, solved with a terrible kind of beauty. But a solution nonetheless." This was the truth of their connection. She did not judge the morality of his actions. She assessed their function, their purpose. She understood that his world had different rules, a different physics. She did not seek to change him or to save him. She simply sought to understand him. And in that understanding, she offered something far more valuable than salvation, validation. He looked at her hand, then back to her face. He felt an impulse, a tectonic shift in his carefully constructed inner world. It was the desire to reach across that small space and take her hand. A simple, human gesture, but it felt more significant, more terrifying, than any act of violence he had ever committed. It would be a surrender, a concession, an admission that he needed a connection, that the fortress was not enough. The sky outside the window was beginning to change, the deep, inky black softening to a bruised indigo. Dawn was coming. The city would soon stir to life, and the roles they had temporarily shed would be waiting for them. He was Rin, the Oyabun in all but name, a man with 1,000 obligations written in blood and honor. She was Cleo, a waitress who read philosophy and saw the world with the clarity of a surgeon. "I have to go," he said. It was a statement of regret. "I know," she said. She did not ask where he was going, or when she would see him again. Such questions were beneath the understanding that had passed between them. They operated on a level of certainty. He stood, and the room once again seemed to shrink around his formidable presence. But something was different. The dangerous, coiled energy was still there, but it was tempered now by a new, quiet vulnerability. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the knob. He paused, his back to her. "The ledger," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Tonight it feels different. Unbalanced in a new way. Perhaps," she said, her voice soft from across the room, "it's not about balancing the old entries. Perhaps it's about starting a new page." He stood there for a long moment, absorbing her words. Then, without turning, he opened the door and stepped out into the pre-dawn hallway. He did not look back. He did not need to. He walked down the creaking stairs and out into the cool, gray morning. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows on the wet pavement. He started walking towards the rising sun, his posture erect, his stride as deliberate as ever. But the weight on his shoulders felt, for the first time in a very long time, just a little bit lighter. In her apartment, Cleo stood at the window, watching his dark figure recede down the empty street until it was swallowed by the city. She picked up his teacup from the table. It was still faintly warm. She did not feel sad or lonely or afraid. She felt a quiet, certain sense of beginning. The sun broke over the horizon, casting the first rays of golden light onto the city of steel and stone, promising the start of a new, uncertain day.